My name is Nancy Bockino, and I work for the Northern Rockies Conservation Cooperative in Grand Teton National Park, conserving whitebark pine in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem for the past 21 years. I perform and facilitate conservation work for this high elevation pine because of several reasons. On the most basic level, whitebark pine and trees in general, they produce oxygen out of carbon dioxide, which is a pretty critical thing in our world these days. In addition, whitebark pine protect the watershed by sheltering the winter snow, so they provide water and oxygen to very basic human needs. Another reason that I do this work is because, like the Dr. Seuss book says, someone needs to speak for the trees. They don't speak our language unless you listen and translate, so I'm the translator. Three observations I have noticed in high elevation ecosystems include much warmer falls and springs. Specifically, we don't have cold snaps in the fall and the spring, where we have negative degree days in, say, April, October, November. Very significant change. The second thing that I notice is much earlier melt off of the snow. In general, we're getting less winter snowpack, and then it's also melting sooner each spring and melting more rapidly. There's a lot more hot days in a row that melts the snow. The third thing that I'm noticing is the human need for these places has increased as the world has changed and as climate change is impacting other parts of the places that we like to spend our time. There's been a humongous increase in recreation in these higher elevation areas, causing them to become even more important and also impacted. More trampling, more garbage, things like that. In addition to those three things, I would say overall, and maybe it's more obvious, but just a significant amount of mortality of high elevation pine trees, and the introduction of non-native species to those ecosystems that were somewhat set apart by cold temperatures. People value high elevation ecosystems for sort of two types of values. The first, I would say, is the ecological value. The high elevation ecosystems in the entire West are critical for water. Right? Our winter snowpack, our mountain snowpack, is what fills the rivers all summer while we await the next winter's snowfall. And that's, ubiquitous across the West. And the whitebark pine are sort of the rooftop of those high elevation ecosystems in that process of watershed protection. We depend on that water for drinking water, for agriculture. We depend on that water for recreation. Some of us are fishing guides and we need the water for work. So that whole set of values is critical in the West. The other set of values would be the more aesthetic values, and I think that that's equally as important, is that humans have this innate need to be in the setting in which they evolved, in their natural setting. They need to be in wild places. They need to know that wild places are safe and wild places are healthy, that they exist, and that they could go climb to these remote places and sit beneath a whitebark pine and just be and be quiet and experience this place so unlike how most of us spend our time in an office or in a city. And there is a phenomenal value in that. I don't know that it's measurable. However, it is one of the most important values that people gain from the alpine. When we think about this high elevation ecosystem and hope for the future and what we're doing for the future, we can sometimes feel overwhelmed because the scale at which these ecosystems are being disturbed doesn't necessarily match what we can do as humans. However, there is a lot of hope, and there's a lot of things that we're doing to work on this for the last 21 years. One of the main things that we do is we're working to replant whitebark pine with whitebark pine that are resistant to one of the impacts that's happening to them, which is a non-native fungus. So we're replanting trees that are resistant to this non-native fungus and saving seed, which can be saved for 30 to 40 years, either stored in a nursery, or we know that whitebark pine seeds are viable in the soil for 30 to 40 years. And so there's a lot of hope just in these seeds. There are a lot of, we call them baby whitebarks. There's a lot of regenerating whitebark in all size classes under the dead whitebark. The forest that we knew before the mountain pine beetle outbreak began in the late 1990s is gone. And in our lifetime, we probably won't see it look the same. However, there is another forest under the dead forest if we take care of the climate so that it can survive and thrive. In addition to those two things, seeds in a forest that exists under the dead forest, I think it's always important to remember as an ecologist that these species, in this case this tree that we speak for, it has a lot of biology that we might not understand, that we might not even know at this point. These trees have been around for 10,000 years. They've gone through warm periods and cold periods, and so they have strategies to deal with catastrophic disturbance as long as we can keep the climate within some sort of spectrum that they can thrive in. In addition to the ecology and hope, I think that there's a lot of hope in the community of people that are passionate about these trees and the support network. Working for 21 years in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, I have seen an amazing amount of collaboration, passion, dedication, and commitment on the level of land managers all the way to people in the Washington office that provide funding. And just that commitment to this challenge is a huge source of hope for me and the trees. The larger implications, sort of the grand strategy of the conservation work that I do in whitebark pine, is this idea that not only are we preserving the trees on the landscape, replanting the trees on the landscape so that there's forests in the future, the idea that we're also educating and reaching out to the people that love these places already and maybe the people that don't even know about these places already, so that we have more value as a society for these high elevation ecosystems that we all rely on, so that we understand that the things that are being impacted by climate change are many. And the more we hear about these things, they include the high elevation pines that we love, maybe we start to make little choices to protect these things in the small ways that we each can that start to accumulate. So the grand strategy in the big picture, we're preserving the trees, but we're also providing a reason for people to care about a place that they love, or an invitation to meet these trees in the place that they live.